The iPod Touch 6th generation is more than 6 years old now. Usually tech that old is basically unusable, but since Apple has a good track record for making long-lasting devices, I wonder, could this iPod be usable in 2022? The design of this iPod Touch is identical to the iPod Touch 7th generation, which was released after it in 2019. On the front, you've got a 4-inch screen, which looks absolutely tiny these days, surrounded by white bezels on this model, though the space gray model had black bezels, which don't stand out as much. With phone bezels being virtually non-existent in 2022, this iPod looks a tad outdated with those chunky bezels. Around the back, you've got a really nice streamlined aluminum shell, which still feels very modern and premium. I must say I'm really partial to the color choices you get with these iPods, with the bright blue and the bright pink being my personal favorites. It's just so distinctive and recognizable as an iPod Touch. It doesn't take too well to scuffing and scratches, and has some small dents in some places, which is forgivable given the age of this device. Holding this iPod in your hands is really cool. It is pretty incredibly light and thin, and made my iPhone 11 feel like a brick in comparison. It is pretty impressive how they crammed all the internals of this iPod into a body this tiny and thin, especially in 2015. On the bottom here, you can see the mono-firing speaker, which sounds pretty crappy. I mean, what were you expecting? It's an iPod Touch. At least there's a pretty decent headphone jack.
Courage.
Now, I'd say the screen holds up today for basic everyday tasks, but not much else past that. It has a pretty low pixel resolution of just 1136 by 640, but since the screen is so small at just 4 inches, it has 326 pixels per inch, which is coincidentally the same as the iPhone 11. So despite the low resolution, it isn't that bad looking, and there aren't any noticeable pixels or screen mesh effect when you look at it from a reasonable distance. The colors and the viewing angles aren't anything special, but they're okay in decent light, but if you're in direct sunlight, it's not going to look very clear. And the tiny size of the screen just makes watching videos really difficult nowadays, especially in the age of enormous, gargantuan 7-inch smartphones. However, for just reading simple text or just navigating the UI, it's perfectly fine. The performance of this iPod does start to show its age. On the inside, you've got an underclocked Apple A8 processor and just 1GB of RAM. That tiny amount of RAM in particular is a bottleneck when it comes to multitasking and switching between apps, and will definitely cause apps to reload much more often. However, in general, I found the performance to be serviceable, even today, when it comes to basic tasks such as web browsing and streaming music. It's perfectly fine for that kind of light use. One big consideration though is that this device is no longer supported by iOS, with the latest version supported being 12.5.5. This means that this iPod will get more and more obsolete as apps will require newer and newer iOS versions to operate. This also means that you'll be missing out on some cool features like dark mode that was introduced in iOS 13, and even some rather simple things like long pressing on the control center icons to bring up connection options, which is quite annoying. The cameras are mediocre, which is to be expected. The rear 8-megapixel camera can get some decent shots in the right light, but the brighter areas tend to look kind of washed out, and low light performance is just bad, though the flash does help. The 1080p 30 frames per second video is also nothing special at all, but for a quick clip during the day, it's usable. The front-facing 1.2-megapixel camera might as well not be there. It's pretty horrendous quality. Just don't take selfies with this thing. So far, it seems like this iPod might make a decent buy if you're on a budget. These can be regularly found for dirt cheap. I got mine for 35 Canadian dollars. However, there's one big downside to this device: the battery. The battery in this iPod is tiny at just 1043 mAh, and even at launch, reviewers stated that the battery life wasn't great. But after more than 6 years, the battery life makes this basically unusable as a daily driver. Mine lasts maybe 2 hours on a charge while streaming music with the screen off, so being near a wall outlet is gonna be necessary. I wouldn't really recommend this thing, even as a beater secondary device, because of that pitiful and hard to replace battery. If you really need a device with this small form factor, may I suggest getting a first-gen iPhone SE. It has the same size screen as the iPod, but is still supported on iOS 15, has cellular, Touch ID, a better camera, faster performance, and a user-replaceable battery for just around $30 more. That's a crazy good value for a device that will have a better long-term longevity and will be a lot more useful day to day. So, unless you're specifically looking for a nostalgic, ultra-thin, mediocre iOS device with a battery life measured in minutes, you probably don't want to get this in 2022. So I don't know if anyone watches these videos, but to anyone who did, big thanks really. Totally new to the YouTube thing. It's a snow day over here, and I discovered the remnants of this video I was making during the summer, and I thought, hey, why not finish it up, you know? Well, anyways, I'm rambling on now, but if you enjoyed that, please consider liking, subscribing, and checking out my other videos.